It started on a Saturday morning while I was fixing the goddamn garage door that's been hanging crooked for weeks. You know how you keep pushing off little things like that because life's busy and you figure there's no rush? That was me. I was half covered in grease, wrestling with the track and swearing under my breath when I heard it, Ellie's laugh. Not just any laugh. The kind of laugh you don't hear every day. The kind of laugh that makes you turn your head, not because it's loud, but because of what's behind it. Joy, flirtation, intimacy. That laugh used to be mine. I used to be the reason she made that sound. And there she was, in the backyard, standing with some guy in a tight blue t-shirt, helping her load flower pots into the wheelbarrow. I paused, watched them through the slats of the wooden fence. She reached up to brush something off his shoulder. Dirt, maybe. Maybe nothing. He said something I couldn't hear, and she slapped his arm in that playful, too familiar way. He laughed too. Deep, low, confident. I didn't recognize him. That's what made it worse. I stayed in the garage, crouched behind the open tool chest, not because I was trying to spy, but because I didn't want them to see me. I didn't want to interrupt something that already felt too intimate. And I didn't want to see what her face looked like when she thought I wasn't around. I kept still as they kept talking, and then, just like that, he was gone. Walked out through the back gate. No goodbye loud enough for me to hear, and she strolled back into the house like it was any other day. When I finally came back in, she was at the sink, rinsing out a coffee mug like nothing had happened. She looked up and smiled, gave me a "Hey, babe," like always, and asked me if I wanted breakfast. Her voice had no tremor, no hint of guilt. That laugh, though, it was still ringing in my ears. I didn't ask about the guy. I just said I wasn't hungry. For the next 2 days, I tried to let it go. Maybe he was just a neighbor. Maybe she was just being friendly. But you don't laugh like that with just anyone. That laugh doesn't come out unless there's something behind it. I started noticing things. She was always out in the yard lately, planting flowers and adjusting patio furniture, stuff she never gave a damn about before. And every now and then, I'd catch her glancing at the backyard like she was waiting for something or someone. On Wednesday, I came home early from work. I parked a few houses down and walked up the side alley, quiet as I could. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity, maybe. Or that gut feeling that's been tightening in my chest since Saturday. The window in the laundry room was cracked open. I heard voices, hers and a man's, low and relaxed, like they'd been talking for a while. "I'm telling you, he never notices anything," Ellie said, her voice soft but with a bite. "You sure?" the guy said, and I recognized that confident chuckle from the yard. "Positive. He still thinks I'm just planting tomatoes out here for fun," she laughed. That laugh again. I didn't move. I didn't storm in or yell. I stood there like a statue, every part of me trying to make sense of what I was hearing. My wife, the woman I shared a bed with for 11 years, the mother of our son, was joking about how clueless I was. Like I was some sitcom husband, too dumb to see what was going on in his own house. She kept talking, but the words started blurring. I couldn't hear anything over the ringing in my ears, couldn't focus over the pounding in my skull. I took one step back, then another, walking away from the window like it was a crime scene. I got back into my car and drove around for 2 hours. Just driving. No music. No destination. Just the sound of the road and the engine and my own thoughts replaying every moment from the past few weeks in a new light. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch in the dark while Ellie slept upstairs. Or pretended to. I watched the shadows move across the walls and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do now. The next morning, I couldn't sit still. I made breakfast for Tyler, packed his lunch, and dropped him off at school like nothing was wrong, even though my stomach felt like it had rocks in it. Ellie kissed him on the cheek and told him to behave, and then she gave me that same familiar smile she always used, the one I used to think meant she loved me. But now, after what I'd heard, it felt like it didn't mean anything at all. I spent most of that day walking through the neighborhood. I didn't go to work, didn't answer calls, didn't check emails. I needed to see that guy again, not just because I wanted to confirm he existed, but because I wanted to look him in the eyes. I didn't know what I was going to do if I saw him, but I knew I had to. I couldn't just sit in that house acting like everything was normal while I was walking around with a bomb in my chest. That afternoon, I came back through the alley behind the house. I stayed out of view, behind the fence near the corner, just out of sight of the kitchen windows. I stood there for about 30 minutes, feeling stupid and desperate and pissed off. Then I heard her voice again. Ellie was outside, this time with a different tone. Less playful, more serious. I don't know if we should keep doing this, she said, her voice low, but not whispering. The guy didn't speak right away. Then he answered in a voice that sounded too confident for someone who was helping destroy a marriage. You're the one who wanted this, remember? She let out a sound, not quite a sigh, more like something stuck in her throat. Yeah, but he's been acting different lately. I think he knows something's up. There it was. She felt it too. The tension. My distance. The way I'd stopped asking questions and started watching her instead. I backed away before they could say anything else, walked around the block, and came through the front door like I'd just gotten back from a long walk. Ellie was in the kitchen when I came in, already back to pretending nothing happened. She asked if I wanted to eat. I said no. I went straight to the bathroom and stared at my face in the mirror for a long time. My eyes looked hollow, like I hadn't slept in days, which I hadn't. My beard was starting to grow in unevenly, and I realized I hadn't shaved since Sunday. It was only Thursday. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I told her I had work to finish, and I crashed on the couch. She didn't argue. That told me everything. If she still cared, if she felt guilty, she would have insisted I come upstairs. She would have tried to talk, tried to make sure things were okay. But she didn't. She just nodded and said, "Okay, I'll see you in the morning." Friday morning, I took Tyler to school again, and this time, I doubled back around the block before going to work. I parked 2 streets over and walked back to the alley behind the house. I was done waiting for pieces. I wanted the full picture. I wanted the truth, whether I could handle it or not. And I got it. Around 9:20 a.m., the guy came through the back gate, like he owned the place. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't checking over his shoulder. That told me this wasn't new. He'd been here before, probably more than once. I waited another 5 minutes, then walked up to the side of the house, crouched down next to the dining room window, and listened. They were sitting in there, just talking, like they were on a date at a cafe. She told him about her plans for the weekend, about how she might take Tyler to the museum on Sunday, and how I'd probably want to stay home and watch one of his boring documentaries. They laughed. My wife and the man she was cheating on me with laughed about how boring I was. I didn't hear anything sexual. They weren't ripping each other's clothes off or sneaking around in the dark. That would have been easier to process, honestly. What I heard was worse. They sounded comfortable, familiar, like this was a regular part of their week. "I think we need to talk about what this is," she said at one point. "I don't want to blow up my life, but I also don't want to lie forever." He didn't say anything right away. Then he told her, "You're not lying if he's not asking. You're just choosing not to tell him." That made me clench my fists so hard I left crescent marks in my palms. I stood there for another minute, then I walked away. I didn't want to hear her agree. I didn't want to know how she rationalized betraying me while sleeping in my bed and calling me her husband. I didn't go to work. I went to a hardware store and bought a set of motion-triggered audio recorders and a few microcams. That night, I installed them while she was sleeping. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed it all. I needed every word, every lie, every moment she chose him over me. Because when I finally made my move, I didn't want there to be any doubt, not in her mind, not in mine, and not in anyone else's. I wanted the truth on record, and I wanted it raw. I waited 2 more days. 2 long, silent, calculated days where I barely spoke to her, didn't touch her, didn't look at her for longer than I needed to. She noticed, of course. She asked me once if everything was okay, and I told her I was just tired from work. That answer seemed to satisfy her, which only made things worse in my head. Either she was too checked out to care, or she was so sure I wouldn't do anything that she didn't bother pressing further. I listened to the audio files when she wasn't around, watched the video clips when I sat in the garage with my laptop late at night, pretending to fix things I had no intention of fixing. There was enough now. Enough to prove everything. I knew the guy's name, Troy. I knew he was a landscaper who did occasional side work for people in the neighborhood. I knew he'd been at our house 3 times in the past 2 weeks, and at least once, they kissed in our living room. Not a quick kiss. A long, quiet one, the kind where both people closed their eyes. Sunday morning came, and I'd had enough. I woke up early, made coffee, and waited at the dining table like it was any other Sunday. Tyler was at my sister's place for the weekend, so it was just the 2 of us in the house. Ellie came down around 9, still in her robe, hair messy, rubbing sleep out of her eyes. "You're up early," she said. I looked at her, really looked, and felt a strange calm settle in my chest. "Yeah, didn't sleep much." She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. The silence between us stretched. She didn't seem in a rush to fill it. I want to ask you something, I said finally. She blinked. Okay. Who's Troy? Her hand froze around the handle of her mug. That was the moment. That flicker in her expression, the way her eyes darted to the window and then back to me. That was when she knew I knew. Why are you asking me that? She said. I think you already know why, I replied, keeping my voice steady. She leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. He's someone who's helped with the yard a few times. He does landscaping work. What's the problem? You've had him over when I wasn't home. Yes, she said, her voice sharp now. Because you've been distant and I needed help. Did you also need his mouth on yours? She didn't say anything. Her jaw clenched, her eyes narrowed. I could feel the anger building in her even before she spoke. Are you spying on me now? She asked. Is that what this is? You're not going to flip this on me, I said. Answer the question. She stood up abruptly, pushing the chair back with a screech. Fine. Yes. I kissed him. Once. It wasn't planned. It happened, and I regretted it. Once. I stood too. Don't lie to me. She stepped back, folded her arms again, her voice louder now. What do you want from me? You've been cold and distant for months. You barely touch me. You barely talk. I felt like I was living with a roommate, not a husband. And your solution was to bring someone else into our home? Into our life? That's how you solve things now. I didn't plan it. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, she said, but her tone wasn't apologetic. It was defensive, tired, like she was trying to convince herself more than me. But it did. It happened because you let it. Because you wanted it to. I didn't want this, she snapped. I didn't want to be in this place, feeling this way. I was lonely, and you were too busy with everything but me. I was busy keeping this house running. I was busy being a father. I didn't realize I also had to compete with a guy who trims hedges for a living. Don't you dare belittle him, she said. At least he listens. At least he notices me. Of course he notices you. He's not married to you. He hasn't seen the side of you that ignores everything unless it benefits her. That stung. I saw it in her face. Her eyes flared, and for a second, I thought she might slap me. But she didn't. She just stared at me like I was someone she didn't know anymore. So what now? She asked, voice low. I'm not making that decision right now, I said. But I wanted you to know that I know. I wanted you to look me in the face and say it out loud. I said it, she whispered. Happy now? No, not even close. She turned and walked away without another word. I stayed there, staring at the spot where she'd been standing, wondering how many times she had lied to my face without blinking. I didn't feel relief or victory. I felt nothing. Just cold, heavy nothing. I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't because I was confused or heartbroken. This time it was because I was planning. Not shouting, not crying, not pacing. Just sitting at the kitchen table, laptop open, legal pad in front of me, going over every small, unimportant-looking thing Ellie had forgotten in the last few months. Because if she wanted to play this game like I didn't matter, then I was going to remind her who she married. I wasn't going to yell or break furniture or post anything online like some bitter teenager. I was going to dismantle her world one careful move at a time and make sure that every piece of this mess came back to her with my fingerprints cleanly off of it. The first step was the finances. Ellie had always left that to me. I handled the mortgage, the credit cards, the savings, everything. She had her own checking account for her spending money, and I never questioned her about it because I never had a reason to. Now I had all the reason I needed. I transferred a portion of our joint savings into a new account under my name only, just enough to make a point, but not enough to trigger alarms. Then I canceled the automatic payments for the yard maintenance. If Troy wanted to hang around our backyard, he could pull weeds for free. After that, I called my lawyer, not to file anything yet, but to ask questions. Quiet questions. About what happens to joint property in the event of adultery. About custody, even though Tyler was almost old enough to decide for himself. About what kind of documentation I would need if I ever wanted to prove what was really going on. By noon I was calm, focused, and done waiting. Ellie was in the kitchen making herself lunch, looking at her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. I walked in and leaned against the counter. She glanced at me, but didn't speak first. I want you to listen, I said. Don't talk. Just listen. She lowered her phone and nodded. I know everything. Not just the kiss. I know how often he's been here. I know what time he shows up. I know what you said to him in the living room. and I know what you told him about me. I've heard the recordings. I've watched the videos. Her face didn't move at first. Then her eyes went wide, and her mouth opened slightly. You what? I said don't talk. She closed her mouth, but her hands started to tremble a little. I've been gathering proof for a while. Not because I needed it for myself. I already knew the truth. But I needed it in case this ever got messy. In case you decided to make me the bad guy when this all falls apart. You recorded us? I told you not to talk. She stepped back, bumping into the table, and looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I'm not filing for divorce yet. But that doesn't mean I won't. What I am doing is making sure that if you ever try to screw me over, financially, emotionally, legally, I will make sure that every person who knows you sees what I've seen. Your friends, your boss, your parents. I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you a guarantee. You leave me out of your games, and I'll leave quietly when the time comes. Her voice was low when she finally spoke. You're blackmailing me? No. I'm protecting myself. She sat down slowly, like the strength in her legs had given out. I watched her, waiting to see if she'd try to spin it, to manipulate her way out like she always did when we argued. But she didn't. She just looked at me and said, I didn't think you had this in you. Well, now you know. I walked out of the room and let her sit with it. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to scream. I just needed her to understand that I wasn't going to be the man who stood quietly in the background anymore while she built a second life behind my back. The next day, she acted like nothing had happened. She made dinner. She folded laundry. She laughed at something on the TV and even asked if I wanted to go out on Friday night. I didn't answer. I just looked at her and shook my head. She didn't push it. I think she finally understood what I was capable of. And that was exactly the point. It was the following Wednesday night when I told her we needed to talk. I'd waited long enough, watched long enough, spoken only when it mattered. I'd done my part, and now I wanted to hear whatever version of the truth she was still holding on to. She was on the couch with her legs tucked under her, phone in hand, scrolling like she didn't have anything heavier on her mind. When I walked into the living room and said her name, she looked up with that blank, tired expression that people wear when they're expecting a lecture but already stopped listening before it starts. I sat in the chair across from her and told her to put her phone down. She did, slowly, like every movement now carried the weight of knowing I wasn't going to pretend anymore. I want to know when it started, I said, keeping my voice level. Not when the kiss happened. Not when you told yourself it didn't mean anything. I want to know when you decided I wasn't enough. She didn't answer right away. She sat still for a while, fingers pressed together in her lap, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't a moment, she said quietly. It wasn't one thing. Then what was it? She shifted slightly, but didn't raise her voice. I stopped feeling like your wife a long time ago. You were always there, physically, but you were somewhere else. Work, the house, our son, bills, whatever it was. I'd talk and you'd nod. I'd ask for something and you'd say okay, but I could tell your mind was somewhere else. You weren't with me. You mean I was doing what had to be done to keep our life from falling apart? No. I mean you made everything else a priority except me. I felt invisible. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. So you felt invisible, and the solution was to bring someone else into our home? Into our backyard? Into our kitchen? You didn't come to me. You didn't ask for counseling. You didn't say anything. You just acted like I was already gone. I did try, she said. You just didn't hear me. Because every time we talked about anything deeper than dinner plans, you shut down. You made excuses. You said you were tired. And when you weren't tired, you were distracted. She looked at me now, finally. I didn't want to fight. I was tired of fighting. There was no fight, I said. You never even gave me the chance to fight. You handed over your loyalty to someone else before I even knew I was supposed to be in a battle. Her jaw tensed. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't some big romantic thing. It was just, he saw me. That's it. He looked at me like I mattered. I let that sit for a moment. Then I spoke slowly, carefully. And what do you see when you look at me now? I see someone I used to feel safe with, she said. Someone who was always steady. And I still respect you. She paused, then added, I don't hate you. That's not the same as love, I said. That's not even close. No, she admitted. It's not. I nodded. Then we both know what has to happen. She flinched, just slightly. You're leaving? No. I'm asking you to. I want you to go stay with your sister for a few weeks. I need time here, with Tyler, without pretending everything is fine when it's not. I'm not kicking you out permanently. I'm asking for space. You owe me that much. I do, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I do owe you that. We sat in silence after that. No crying, no shouting, no dramatic scenes. Just the quiet realization that something that used to be real between us had broken down so completely that neither of us even knew how to name it anymore. She packed a small bag that night and left the next morning without saying goodbye to Tyler. I told him she was visiting Aunt Melissa for a while and that we'd see her soon. He didn't ask many questions. Kids always know more than we give them credit for. The house felt different after she left. Not emptier, not sadder, just clearer. Like there was finally room to breathe again. I sat at the kitchen table that night with a beer in the silence and didn't feel like I was going to break apart anymore. I just felt tired. Not the kind of tired that makes you sleep, but the kind that comes from finally laying down the weight you've been carrying for too long. A week after she left, the house was quieter in a way that didn't feel like loss. Tyler and I fell into a rhythm that was simple, predictable, and honest. We made dinner together, sat on the couch with the dog between us, watched movies, and talked about school, about his math teacher who apparently had zero patience and a weird obsession with owls. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. What mattered was that I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't forcing myself to swallow things I couldn't unsee or forgive. I wasn't acting like we were a happy family when half of it had already checked out long before the truth came out. One afternoon, Ellie texted and said she wanted to talk. I told her she could come by the house after dinner. I didn't want her around Tyler while we were sorting through what came next. She arrived just after 7, dressed casually, face bare, no attempt to dress it up or soften what this was. She sat at the same table we had that first real conversation at, and I didn't offer her anything to drink. She didn't ask. I've been staying with Melissa, she said, like I didn't already know. It's given me time to think. I didn't reply right away. I waited to see where she was going with it. I understand why you're angry. I get why you feel like you can't trust me. I made a mess of something that meant everything to you. To us. I've been trying to figure out how I got here, and I keep thinking maybe it was too many little things that piled up without either of us noticing. Little things don't lead to cheating, I said calmly. Choices do. She nodded. I know, and I made the wrong ones. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. So what do you want from me now? I want to talk about what we're doing. About the marriage. About what happens next. I looked at her for a long moment. You had months to talk about that. You had all the time in the world to ask for help, to say something wasn't working, to be honest. You didn't. You waited until you got caught. And now you're here because you don't like the consequences, not because you've changed. That's not fair, she said. You think I'm just trying to save face? I think you're trying to find the softest landing possible, and I'm not going to give it to you. I'm not going to pretend I want this to go back to what it was. It wasn't working, and now we know why. She swallowed hard. So that's it. I shook my head. No, it's not it. We still have a son. We still have to figure out what that looks like. But the marriage is done. You made that choice. I just finally accepted it. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She sat there, shoulders tense, and nodded like she'd been waiting to hear it out loud. I think she already knew I wouldn't change my mind. She stood up slowly and grabbed her keys. I'll talk to a lawyer, she said. I'll be fair. You'll be honest, I said. That's all I want now. She turned toward the door, paused, then looked back. Despite everything, I never wanted it to end like this. Neither did I said, and I meant it. When the door closed behind her, I sat there for another hour. Not thinking, not planning, just sitting, letting it be over. It didn't feel like victory or defeat. It felt like something necessary, like something overdue. 2 weeks later, we signed the papers. It wasn't dramatic. We met at the lawyer's office, reviewed everything, and signed. We agreed on joint custody. We agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds. We even agreed not to drag Tyler into our problems. That was one thing we were both clear on. He didn't deserve to carry any of this. The last thing she said to me before leaving that office was simple. I hope you find someone who sees you. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't need to respond to that. I wasn't looking for anyone to see me. I was finally learning how to see myself again. Since then, I've kept things steady. Tyler spends half the week with me, half with her. We talk when we need to, but not more than that. I deleted the videos. I deleted the recordings. Not because I forgave her, but because I didn't want to keep living in that moment. I needed to move forward, And keeping those files felt like holding onto a wound and picking at it every day. Life isn't better or worse now. It's just mine again. And for the first time in a long time, that's enough.